12 miles away. Both when it was legal or illegal, Indians went there to buy whiskey. The Indians are one of several racial groups with a great susceptibility to whiskies. The Indians are one of several racial groups with a great susceptibility to alcoholism. In most cases, it did not take much liquor to make them thoroughly drunk. In that condition, they were easily robbed of their money. Indian girls and women were also raped, being in no state to resist or even to know what was happening. More than a few told me of their ugly experiences. I was in fact called to testify before a grand jury and later at a trial. Some white men involved in the construction of a new school building on the reservation also testified before the grand jury. At the trial, those men failed to appear. A foreman denied any knowledge of the matter. There had been many payoffs, I was told, to ensure acquittal. The jury of 12 white men, good and true, who could truthfully claim a lack of evidence, naturally returned a not guilty verdict. Even now it angers me to recall such Even now it angers me to recall such incidents. The exploitation of Indians in areas adjacent to the reservations is a very real and grim fact. At the same time, an honest accounting must record the sins on both sides. Some Indians were lawless. They stole from shopkeepers whose backs were turned. I recall a white man in the mining camp on business proudly showing off a new car, one of the very first ones available after the end of World War II. I told him to lock his car, and he laughed at my Christian insistence on the depravity of fallen man. It was a very cold night, and while the car owner was in the bar, a very drunk and sick Indian crawled into the car and vomited all over the driver's seat. What followed is revealing of human nature. The Indian, having slept for a time, got out of the car and ran off in the dark, unidentified. I had just finished a pastoral visit nearby and arrived on the scene as the owner was profanely viewing his polluted new car. The sight of me and the fact that my warning had been a sensible one only enraged him further. Given his profanities, you would have thought I was the guilty person. Such is human nature. Man is a fallen creature, whatever his race or colour. Without the grace of God, he is evil and even dangerous. In time I came to realize that the Indians were victimized because their way of life made them victims. They could see that the Christian Indians prospered and were not victimized, but they preferred to be follow their own fallen ways and to complain about exploitation. To illustrate, one of the Indian elders of our church, Guy Manning, was a Shoshone. He was part white and perhaps part Chinese, blonde and blue-eyed, a remarkable Christian and a man with a good sense of humour. Besides his cattle, he had an apple orchard and kept bees and sold honey. He also had a family garden. The war took his sons into various branches of the service, and he had his cattle and hay meadows and those of his sons to care for. He was arthritic and could not mount a horse without help. When he irrigated the hay fields, a young granddaughter accompanied him to run for help in case he stumbled and fell, because he could not get up without help. One Saturday afternoon, he took the family for a picnic at Lamb's Creek Reservoir. After eating, he stretched out to nap, his hat over his eyes, while the children fished. Suddenly he was awakened by his granddaughter screaming, "Grandpa, Grandpa, there's a rattlesnake on you!" He looked under the brim of his hat to see a very large rattler crawling over him. Instantly and instinctively, he jumped up and landed some feet away. As he flew through the air, the rattler turned and struck at him, its fangs clinging to Guy's coat for a moment before it fell. Its fangs clinging to Guy's coat for a moment before it fell off. Guy stood there in shock, amazed at his prodigious leap. "Better than ever I did when I was young," he told me. He decided that if a scare could produce that much energy, he could muster it for his daily work, and he did. He went back to his old vigour and activities. Now, Guy Manning was one of the Indians periodically voted onto the tribal council, made council chairman, and relied on, with other Christians, to clean up the reservation. Fairly soon, drunkenness would be abated, order restored, and the Indian court made to function ably. But sinners, whites or Indians, for all of their complaining, can only stand law and order for so long. As a result, non-Christians would be voted back onto the council, the situation would deteriorate until it became intolerable, and then the Christians would again be voted in, albeit briefly. Not only was Guy never in trouble or exploited, but he was a better manager of his affairs than were often well-paid white officials of the Indian service who were supplied with residences and vehicles. While officials would try to protect the Indians by controlling their cattle receipts, I recall a top agency official pressuring Guy to allow him to keep his cattle check and pay the Mannings' bills. Guy refused, but the official still refused to turn over the check. Finally, Guy said, plainly and bluntly, "I know you. Every weekend you spend your time at the Mountain City Hotel bar getting drunk. Why should I turn over my affairs to a man like you?" The official never forgave him. In another instance, Guy exposed the misuse of tribal and other funds by a superintendent, a fanatical Catholic who was determined to save the Indians from the Protestant mission with misappropriated funds. Guy's documented charges hit the media from coast to coast. An Indian Service investigation whitewashed the superintendent, but transferred him, knowing his guilt and the tribe's anger. Guy Manning was not one to be victimized because he was a free man in Christ. To cite one more example, a girl, Josephine Roa, half Shoshone and half Hispanic, was highly intelligent, thoroughly godly, and a beautiful person. She was one of 3 sisters, all Christians. Josephine was a grace-filled woman. In any community or group, she would have stood out, as did Leah Manning and others in our church. It was a joy to know Josephine. She could always be counted on to be helpful. She studied at the Cook Training Institute, Cook Christian. She studied at the Cook Christian Training School in Phoenix, and she married a Nez Perce, Carl Dixon, who became a pastor. They moved to Oklahoma, where Carl served in ministry. I can only think of Josephine with respect and affection. While we live in the world, and the best of us experience evil things, a persistent pattern of exploitation implies moral failure. The question is not one of racial inferiority. That is a humanistic myth. Christian faith and morality are necessary to progress against Christian faith and morality are necessary to progress against sin and exploitation. We are told in 1 John 5:4, "For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world, and this is a victory that overcometh the world, even our faith." End quote. I reminded Indian groups that when missionaries from the Near East and the Mediterranean would first... Schnapsies. What's wrong with this? What's the matter? basic items, gonna do the glue, paste, cut. Let me cut. I'll just scoop it out of the way. There we go. I reminded Indian groups that when missionaries from the Near East and the Mediterranean world first moved into Northern and Western Europe, they despaired at times that the barbarians they met could ever be made into a godly and law-abiding people. In Christ, however, in time they became the bulwark of Western and Christian culture, even as now, without Christ, they are returning to barbarism. All right, that was chapter 14. Guess what's next? Can you guess? Yes, indeed, chapter 15. See you there. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Okay, it's chapter 15. Hit the record. Let's go. "15. The invented Indian. Most people know, or did a generation or two ago, that the peoples of the Americas were called Indians because Columbus thought he had reached India. At one time, no American native considered himself an Indian. He was an Abenaki, a Cherokee, an Iroquois, an Aztec, Maya, Paiute, Shoshone, or some other kind of person. These peoples did not call themselves tribes. Like the term Indian, the word tribe was alien to them. It came from the Bible. At present, the, quote, American Indian, end quotes, makes much of that term and uses it to promote special rights and privileges, but the term is part of the modern humanistic remaking of a people to fit into a worldview which idealizes, quote, primitive peoples, end quote, and sees them as representing the best in human history. As noted, the term Indian probably referred to the people of India, a few Paiutes and Shoshones who had visited the city. What is wrong? What's wrong with this? There we go. A few Paiutes and Shoshones who had visited cities where Indians from India lived were either amused or offended at the thought of being likened to them. The East Indians, themselves a diverse people, are the antithesis of the American, quote, Indians, end quote, and the thought of being lumped under the same name was sometimes offensive to American Indians, as it may have been to East Indians as well. The gratuitous assumption that all of the peoples of the Americas can be lumped under a common name is an unwarranted one, and in earlier years gave some offence. It was comparable to calling a Frenchman or a Spaniard a German simply because a common continent and, quote, whiteness, end quote, marked them. The Indians identified themselves in my day as Shoshone, Paiute, Pima, and so on, although among themselves each saw themselves as the people. This is not a trivial point. American natives did not share a common culture, nor were their lives static. The rise of the Aztecs shattered the lives of the other peoples from The rise of the Aztecs shattered the lives of the other peoples of Mexico, and Cortés was their deliverer from Aztec human sacrifice and cannibalism. Those quote-unquote tribes, which first acquired horses, devastated those who were without that. devastated those who were without that advantage. The Paiutes with horses were able to go from what is now Nevada to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo, dry the meat, and then return home. These trips, as Louis Dave told me, were dangerous and difficult. Other Indians could cause serious problems, though the hunt was for stragglers. Though the hunt was for stragglers in the herds, usually old or pregnant buffalo cows, the buffalo themselves were dangerous. Some people were friendlier to whites than to other Indian groups for the simple reason that they did not identify with anyone racially, but in terms of whatever advantage they might gain in dealing with them. Racial identifications were invented by the white man. In the earlier days, intermarriage was not seen as demeaning to the white man. There is another fact of some importance. The white American of my boyhood was a very different person than the American of today. The change in the national character from 1922 to 1992 is a dramatic one. White Americans have remade themselves into another kind of people. The same is true of the Indian. In my day, it was still white Christian America that was the norm. The Paiute or Shoshone might sometimes react against that norm, but he still recognized it as dominant. Since then, statist education has dramatically altered and remade white and black Americans and Indians as well. The humanistic view of the, quote, primitive Indian, end quote, and the ideas of Rousseau have reshaped the Indian image of himself and his past. Consequently, all groups in America are guilty of mythical thinking about themselves and about one another. I mentioned earlier the sadness of the older Indians at their grandchildren's radical disinterest in the Paiute and Shoshone pasts. It was not because the elders idealized their past, but simply a desire that their lives and struggles be known and understood. The children, however, preferred the popular American culture and whatever the state schools taught them about themselves. Few white Americans know their great-grandparents' names or where they lived. The same was true of the Paiutes and Shoshone children. Where and how their great-grandparents lived was of no interest to them. The school basketball game was far more important. Like their white counterparts, they were implicit existentialists. Only the moment was real. This practical existentialism is basic to the fact that American Indians, like their white counterparts, live in a world of myths about themselves. The realities of their past are of no concern to them because the myths are more in tune with the existential moment. Since I had read all that. Since I had read all that I could find in the University of California at Berkeley library stacks on Paiutes and Shoshones, I found that I knew more about these peoples than their younger generation did. Still, I could not interest the young in their past. The popular culture of the American scene, liquor and sex were of more concern to them. These are the same concerns that mark white American youth, and this should not surprise us. Quote-unquote whites and quote-unquote Indians have shared a country and a common history for a few hundred years, although much less in the American West. However often isolated from one another physically, the cultural influences have been similar. Some children from strong Christian families have been able to resist the existentialist currents of the 20th century, but all still live in a common culture and world, and the effect on all has been destructive. Because only the moment is real for existentialism, it has given us a fictional world, an invented past, an invented American quote-unquote white man, and an invented quote-unquote Indian. As a result, people know little about either theirs or the Indians' past. There we go. That was chapter 15. Hope you enjoyed that. Guess what's next? Da-da-da-da. You guessed it. Chapter 15. 16. See you soon. Okay, gonna hit the record button, hopefully. There we go, 16. 16. Indians and anthropologists. There are some anthropologists whose writings are intelligent and accurate up to a point, but there is a serious problem in anthropological studies and in science generally, which leads to a serious perversion of reality. I'm not talking just about the works of people like Margaret Mead, exposed as a fraud by Freeman, but still treated as an, quote, authority, end quote. There's also John Nance's The Gentle Tassaday. There is also John Nance's The Gentle Tassaday, a Stone Age people in the Philippine rainforest, with a foreword by Charles A. Lindbergh, 1975, which many claimed on a variety of grounds to be a hoax, but which was republished in 1988. Again and again, quote-unquote, scientists have been determined to, quote-unquote, discover the natural good man, untainted by Christianity. The American Indians have been a frequent candidate for this sort of revisionism. First of all, the approach to the many so-called primitive peoples is anti-historical. Can we treat the English of today, or those of the Venerable Bede's day, the same as the naked, blue-painted warriors the Romans encountered? The idea is absurd. The same is true of the American Indians. A static notion is absurd. The coming of the white man created a ripple effect from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Even more, the arrival and capture of Spanish horses revolutionized American Indian life. Those in the West who got horses first immediately became, quote, advanced, end quote. The horse was more responsible for changes in Indian life than anything else. Second, American Indian life was not static and unchanging. There was no commitment to a mythical, quote, primitive, end quote, lifestyle that bound them to the past. Tribes learned quickly from each other and from the French, English, Spanish, and Americans. They were not stupid like white nativists. They were ready to improve their lives. They had less commitment to their past than did the white men. The Shoshone and Paiutes life I knew in the 1940s and early 1950s was not the life they lived in 1900, nor are they the same now, 1992. (1992). A fixed idea of Indian life and culture is absurd. Third, apart from a dedication to their faith in primitivism and environmentalism, many scholars in this area, as in others, strive to be value-free, meaning really anti-Christian. Consider this statement by John Manship.
He's the main chippy-chippy, the main chippy-chap.
Consider this statement by John Manship White, quote, polyandry, the system whereby a woman was the wife of more than one man, is not attested in North America, though Eskimo tribesmen were in the habit of offering their wives for the sexual pleasure of the guests, and the Shoshonean women were permitted by certain tribes to have sexual intercourse with other members of the tribe while their husbands were away hunting, end quote. This is not a lie, but neither is it the truth. No Shoshone man wanted to share his wife or daughter with any other man. I knew one Shoshone woman whose nose had been cut off by her husband for adultery. This was an ancient punishment, although not always used. White's statement is false because it is, quote, scientific, end quote, that is, value-free, and therefore a distortion and a lie. In a band of Indians, a small group of families, a leader could order some men to hunt while others protected the camp. As the strong man, the leader could take another man's wife, knowing that the husband was in no position to challenge his authority or position. The husband's, quote, consent, end quote, was pragmatic and life-preserving, nothing more. Any move for revenge would have led to anarchy and mass killings. Similarly, when white men first appeared in the scene, their technological superiority was at once apparent. Various choices were open to the Indians. They could kill the stranger or strangers and take everything. Usually, however, before first encountering a white man, most Indians had heard of them and their numbers, their killing power, and their very valuable goods. More than a few tribes, in fact most, found it wiser to accommodate the white man. More than a few of the leaders of Indian uprisings were regarded by many of their peoples as foolhardy and suicidal. Curiously, these men are the men Americans often honour, sometimes calling them chiefs, which they were not. When the white man came to an encampment where the Indians were determined to be friendly, the Indians stressed trade and peace. Peace could mean access to Indian women. Venereal disease often passed both ways, from whites to Indians and from Indians to whites. A great deal of the sexual availability of the Indian woman rested on the simple fact that it was part of an effort to keep potentially dangerous visitors happy and to extract gifts from them. The Lewis and Clark expedition reported that some tribesmen gave their wives to elderly warriors and hunters on a temporary basis, or to a powerful stranger in the hope that the abilities of the man could be transferred to the woman thereby. It is questionable whether men have ever offered their women to other men unless they expected to get something in return. My point is that White's statement, while accurate, is value-free and hence false. It gives a warped picture of Indian life. During the Depression of the 1930s, when I was a student, I knew more than one graduate student who prospered by making his wife available to a key faculty member. With some homosexual professors, the student, quote, got ahead, end quote, by making himself available. I had a passing acquaintance with a couple who both held easy federal jobs, she under her maiden name because married women were less likely to be employed. The quote-unquote boss, head of a minor office with 4 or 5 men under him, was very soon adulterously involved with the young woman. She would leave work an hour early at the boss's request, and he would follow soon afterward to join her in her apartment before he went home. Both husband and wife put up with it because jobs were scarce, but it soon ended their marriage. This job blackmail, if described in the professor's value-free language as typical of American life in the 1930s, would be factually correct, while being an outrageous lie. I'm not saying that American moral standards in the 1930s and American Indian standards circa 1800 are comparable. Rather, we must insist that neither can be discussed. Value-free. When men gave their wives to others, the purpose was pragmatic. It was either self-protection or it was to gain something from the other man. On the reservation, if the adultery took place without permission, and this was common, the husband became angry and vented his anger on his wife. Adultery was common, and it was considered wrong, no matter how prone all were to it. Indians grew to be skeptical of scholars and found them frustrating. Say we were to meet a university researcher doing a, quote, definitive, end quote, study of the U.S. Constitutional Convention in terms of the use of snuff, liquor and tobacco by the delegates, giving a detailed analysis of utensils and dress. We would consider this man with disdain. His book would tell us nothing valuable about either the Constitution or its architects. One woman, Jessie Little, very superior and gracious, but regrettably involved in the peyote cult, was an, quote, informant, end quote, to an anthropologist before my time on the reservation. He found her resistant to some of his questions. She told me that he was not at all interested in what she had to say, but interested only in answers to his, quote, stupid, end quote, questions. He had come with an agenda, with a preconceived framework about the reality of Paiute life, and he wanted to concentrate on that. Too full of themselves and lacking empathy, anthropologists too often assumed that the older Indians could not distinguish between myth and history. They imposed Darwinian presuppositions upon their subjects. They asked their set of questions and left, with some rare exceptions. With some rare exceptions, the academicians hated Christians and missionaries. They were bigots who believed themselves the only wise and enlightened ones. Shall have a ting. Shabba-labba. Oh, there's a click there. Whoopsie daisies.
Whoopsie daisies.
Indians are not stupid. Whatever their faults, they lack neither feelings nor intelligence. To be treated like flora and fauna to be studied was for many of them offensive, and for some a source of pain. I have mentioned the Indian's readiness to change. He very quickly picked up the vague public Christianity of Americans and, as far as possible, conformed his life to it. He has just as quickly picked up the modern culture of television, rock and roll, and more to his own hurt. The revolution in Indian life since World War II has been dramatic. The cult of primitivism and Indianization has spread rapidly. We now have a younger generation of Indians and agitators whose model of Indian derives from American liberal mythology. These new Indians have become actors, playing an expected part and accepting as true a vast realm of white American mythology about the Indian past. This vision of the Indian past is a static one, as is the vision of our white American.
Shalabata.
As is the vision of our white American primitivists and environmentalists. They are interested in more than just turning back the clock. They call for a return to a timeless fairyland which has existed only in their imaginations. A vision based on a candid realism moves history forward. One based on mythology surrenders and destroys it. How'd you like them apples? You like them apples? How'd you like them apples, huh? You like them apples? Okay. Let's do 17, why not? Okay, see you in chapter 17. Okay, welcome to chapter 17. Gonna hit the record button. And let's go. 17. The fallacy of primitivism. Our thinking about various peoples too often begins with an illusion. We divide them into, quote, primitive, end quote, and, quote, civilized, end quote, peoples with some gradations between them. The actual difference is moral and religious. Did I tinkle? Did that? Let's cut that out anyway. Darwinism has seriously warped our views of people on one of the Marquesas. Marquesas. Darwinism has seriously warped our views of people on one of the Marquesas Islands studied by Dr. and Mrs. Robert C. Suggs, who published a report in 1962. The change in the islanders' sexual morality from their first contact with Europeans to the present is very slight. By keeping outsiders from knowledge of their language, the people are able to maintain their culture with ease. The children of these islanders are trained and used in a number of violent and abusive practices, which are nearly universally considered serious criminal offences in other cultures, including those that have repudiated any obligation to a specifically Christian ethic. The French priests were unable to change the lives of their parishioners, who began their moral dereliction from early childhood. The priests Suggs met paid a grim price for their years of hard work. Suggs cited the case of one priest, quote, reduced to babbling idiocy by 38 years of toil amongst his unrepentant, resentful flock, end quote. Is this a racial problem? The people of the island are descendants not only of Marquesan Polynesians, but also of Annamese, American Negroes, Chinese, and assorted European peoples. Their genetic history is a quote-unquote good one. Their condition is one arising from a moral and religious choice. In biblical law, marriage with unbelievers is forbidden as treason to the covenant, Deuteronomy 7:3, Exodus 34:12-16. Marriage with a believer from an evil and debased people was possible, but the descendants of such a union could not, quote, enter into the congregation, end quote, that is, become officers or leaders unto the third, even the 10th generation, depending on the moral and religious background of the convert's subculture. An example of such a marriage is Ruth and Boaz. Ruth was honoured and respected, but it was only with David that the exclusion ended insofar as authority was concerned. The problem was not racial. It was moral and religious. The Indians were not, quote, primitive, end quote, peoples. They were morally and religiously decadent, and the same can be said for all the Europeans and other advanced peoples at one stage or another in their history. Certainly, the culture of Western man is moving downhill towards the Certainly, the culture of Western man is moving downhill towards the Polynesian level described by Suggs. It must be added that the moral differences between the various Indian peoples were very real. Some men were like Chief Washaki, why not? Some men were like Chief Washaki of the Shoshones, an early convert and an Episcopal mission, and a remarkably superior man. Dr. Carlos Montezuma of the Yapval Apache served early in the 20th century at the Western Shoshone Reservation as a medical doctor. The Reverend Sherman Coolidge, a Northern Arapaho and an Episcopalian rector, was a very able and effective pastor. There were differences among the tribes and among the peoples in a tribe. It is not an accident of history that existentialism arose in the 20th century and so powerfully influenced Western history. With its emphasis on the moment, not faith in history, existentialism feeds the urge to become, quote, primitive, end quote, and pleasure-oriented. While existentialism as a philosophy is now less prominent as a state of mind, it is becoming omnipresent. Existentialism is a normal state among so-called, quote, primitive, end quote, peoples. What has no meaning in terms of the moment is not remembered. While on the Western Shoshone Reservation, I had an Indian girl come in weekly to help with the housework. Can you imagine? While on the Western Shoshone Reservation, I had an Indian girl come in weekly to help with the housework, such things as ironing and briefly babysitting. When I returned briefly 3 years later, I saw her near a store and greeted her. She had no recollection of me whatsoever. I found this kind of episode commonplace. If a relative of an Indian family visited from Port Hall, the children 3 months later would not remember the incident because it was no... Very curious. If a relative of an Indian family visited Fort Hall, the children 3 months later would not remember the incident because it was of no importance to them. This was not true of members of the older generation who were a part of a culture in which memory of a practical sort meant life. The protective atmosphere of reservation life made an existentialist life possible. Since my time, the reservation has become a centre of causal casual... Since my time... Since my time, the reservation has become a centre of casual suicide. For the roving bands of Indians prior to the reservation, life had been tenuous, death was always close. They could not afford the casualness of reservation Indians. Indian life has not been static. Many of the American Indians have seen the rise and decline of Christian faith and of advance and retreat in terms of growth beyond their earlier ways of living. The older generation I knew relished telling stories of their past, but they resented the attempts of the white man to bind them to that past. They had seen dramatic changes in the lives of white men from ox carts. Changes in the life of white men from ox carts to airplanes, and they saw no reason why Indians should be chained to the Indian past. Such an approach was to treat them as zoo specimens and the Indian reservation as an anthropologist's sanctuary and laboratory. To a few of the younger men, this was appealing. It gave them an opportunity to exploit the white man's folly. By the time I left, some of the Native American movements were beginning to make inroads. Their effect was to place a roadblock in the way of development and growth among Indians. If tomorrow a conquering power were to require that all white Americans return to the lifestyles and If tomorrow a conquering power were to require that all white Americans return to the lifestyles and conditions of their ancestors of 2 centuries ago... Let's try that again. It's a bit breathy, isn't it? If tomorrow a conquering power were to require that all white Americans return to the lifestyles and conditions of their ancestors of 2 centuries ago, they would rightfully consider it a form of oppression. It is no less oppressive when applied to the Indian. Hard-hitting.
Hit hard. Slaboo.
All right, well, that was chapter 17. Let's have a go at chapter 18, shall we? Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.